They came just after sunrise. No warning, no invitation. Just the heavy knock of authority pretending to wear a smile. Carl McDonald had barely taken his first sip of coffee when it happened. The breeze outside was cool, dancing gently across the flower beds he'd spent all weekend planting. The backyard was finally coming together. It had taken months to feel even remotely like home, but this little patch of peace, it was his. A quiet sanctuary on the edge of suburbia. His fresh start. And yet somehow, it only took one morning for everything to fall apart. He set his mug down slowly, the clink of ceramic on wood far too loud in the sudden silence that followed the knock. Something felt off, and it wasn't. Just the timing. There was a weight behind that sound, a pressure, like whoever was out there believed they had the right to be feared. Carl walked cautiously toward the front door, eyes narrowing as he looked through the peephole. 5 figures, matching dark uniforms, radios on their belts, clipboard, badges. But these weren't police. The patches across their chests spelled something far worse, at least in his world. Homeowner Association Enforcement. He blinked, opened the door just enough to speak. "Can I help you?" The man at the front, stocky, clipboard in hand, voice sharp enough to cut steel, didn't even bother with courtesy. "Mr. McDonald, we're here on behalf of the Westwood Homeowners Association to address multiple violations on your property." Carl furrowed his brow, confused. "Violations? I'm sorry, but I'm not even part of a homeowners association." The man didn't flinch. "According to our records, you are. And you've been issued several non-compliance notices. As of today, enforcement actions are being taken." Carl took a breath, steadying the heat building in his chest. "There must be some mistake. I moved in 3 months ago. I haven't received anything. My house isn't within your HOA's jurisdiction." But it didn't matter, because by then one of them had already walked right past him, without permission, stepping into his yard as if it belonged to them. Measuring tape unspooling in hand, scribbling into a little pad, eyes judging every inch of Carl's sanctuary. "Hey!" Carl called out, stepping onto the porch. "You can't just walk onto my property like that." The leader remained cold. "We have authority to enforce community regulations." "No, you don't," Carl snapped. "Not here. This isn't your jurisdiction." Another uniformed man moved toward the side of the yard and began tearing at Carl's wooden fence. "What the hell are you doing? Stop!" Carl shouted, racing forward. "Non-compliant fencing," the man mumbled without even looking at him. "Unapproved by the HOA." Carl reached for his phone and started recording. "You're trespassing. I'm calling the police." This time, the leader gave a smug little smirk. "Mr. McDonald, I suggest you calm down. Interfering with enforcement actions could result in legal repercussions. You're already facing fines." Carl's grip on the phone tightened. "Fines? For what? You have no authority over this property. Get off my land." The man only chuckled. "You can take it up with the board. But these violations are being corrected now." And with that, the uniforms scattered like crows in a cornfield. All over Carl's backyard. One yanked his flowers from the ground like weeds. Another dismantled the gate he had stained by hand. The shed, the one that had belonged to his father, was deemed non-compliant and marked for immediate removal. Carl yelled. He pleaded. Then finally, feeling completely helpless, he called 911. But even that brought no relief. The dispatcher's voice was robotic, distant, more scripted than sincere. "Sir, this sounds like a civil matter. I recommend contacting an attorney." He stood there, phone still pressed to his ear, watching strangers rip apart the only peaceful place he'd had in years. Neighbors started gathering on the sidewalk, whispering, watching. One older woman, gray hair pulled back in a loose braid, worry lines etched deep into her face, stepped closer. "What's happening, dear?" she asked gently. "They say my house is under the HOA," Carl said, his voice shaking, "but I'm not a member. I never have been." The woman frowned. "You're not. The last owner opted out years ago. Everyone on this side knows that." "Exactly," Carl nodded bitterly. "But they don't seem to care." By the time the enforcement team finally left, the backyard was in ruins. Fence gone, flower beds trampled, shed in splinters. They didn't even look back. Carl stood there, surrounded by debris, drenched in silence, and realized something terrifying. They thought they could get away with it. He was just one man, quiet, unassuming, no HOA membership. No loud voice in the community, just someone who wanted peace, and that, to them, meant he was easy to bully. But they were wrong. So very, very wrong. He went inside, closed the door, locked it, even though it felt symbolic more than anything now. Then he grabbed a notebook, began scribbling every detail he could remember, uniform descriptions, their words, their actions, timestamps, even the way the neighbors looked at him. Every second mattered. Every memory was now evidence. Then he opened his laptop, started digging. The Westwood HOA had a sleek website, clean, polished, full of flowery language about community pride and preserving neighborhood excellence. But buried inside the pages, Carl found what he was looking for: a jurisdiction map, a thick red boundary line looped around the HOA's authority like a fence of its own. And Carl's house? It was clearly outside that line. He printed the map, drew a bright red circle around his address. This was proof, undeniable. Next, the deed. He logged into the county records and pulled up his property documents. No mention of an HOA, no binding contracts, no obligations. Nothing. Carl sat back in his chair, breath short but steady. This was real. This wasn't some misunderstanding. They had no power over him. None, and yet they came anyway. Why? He kept searching, eventually stumbling across an old article from 3 years prior. Westwood HOA attempts jurisdiction expansion, proposal rejected by residents. Carl read it twice. The article named several streets the HOA had wanted to annex, including his. But the measure failed. The community had spoken. So what was this? An accident? Or something far more sinister? The next morning, Carl walked into the HOA's local office, a quiet, sterile building tucked behind a shopping plaza. The woman at the front desk greeted him with a strained smile. "Good morning. How can I help you?" Carl dropped his notebook and documents on the counter. "I need to speak with someone in charge. Now." Her smile flickered, then faded. "Do you have an appointment?" "No." "But your team destroyed my property yesterday." "I'm not leaving without answers." She hesitated, picked up the phone, and spoke in a whisper. After a moment, she nodded toward the hallway. "You can speak with Mr. Radcliffe. He's the head of the board." Carl walked in, heart pounding. Behind the desk sat a man who looked like he'd never heard the word consequence in his life. Sharp suit, sharper smile, and when he said, "Mr. McDonald, how can I help you?" It sounded more like a threat than a question. Carl dropped the map in front of him. "My property isn't part of your HOA. Here's your boundary map. Here's my deed. You had no right to send anyone onto my land." Radcliffe leaned back in his chair, calm, detached. "There seems to be a misunderstanding. We'll review your documents and get back to you." Carl's voice didn't shake this time. "No. You'll answer for what your team did. You broke the law. And I'm not going to let this go." Radcliffe just smiled again, and that was the moment. Carl understood. This wasn't a mistake. It was a test. They thought he wouldn't fight. They were wrong. It was strange. How quickly something familiar could feel foreign. Carl stood at the edge of his backyard, now stripped bare. What had once been green and vibrant, alive with the quiet beauty of everyday effort, had become a battlefield. Torn earth, splintered wood. The silence now wasn't peaceful. It was eerie, hollow, like the soul of this place had been ripped out and stomped flat by the boots of people who didn't care. How could they just show up and take? The next morning came like a fog, but Carl moved with purpose. He made his coffee as usual. The routine mattered now, more than ever. But this time, he didn't sit to drink it. He carried it with him, steam rising in soft ribbons, as he walked back to the kitchen table where he had laid out every scrap of paper he'd printed the night before. The map from the HOA website, his deed, the property tax record, the rejection, article about the jurisdiction expansion, every photograph of the damage, the time-stamped video on his phone, now transferred to a USB stick. It was all real, undeniable, but it still didn't feel like enough, because they'd gotten away with it. They didn't stop when he told them to. They didn't care when he showed them proof. They didn't flinch when he called 911. And when he marched into their office demanding answers, Radcliffe had looked at him like a child throwing a tantrum, like a man screaming underwater. But that smugness had given Carl something unexpected, clarity. This was no longer just about his backyard. This was about every homeowner who'd ever felt small, every neighbor who'd paid a silent fine, every resident who whispered instead of shouting. This was about power, and how easily it could be abused when no one questioned it. Carl reached for his laptop and searched for attorneys who specialized in property law. The reviews didn't matter. The flashy taglines didn't matter. He wanted someone who had seen this before, who'd gone to war with HOAs and walked out with fire in their veins. One name stood out. Monica Ellison. Direct, no nonsense. Experienced in HOA overreach. Her website didn't scream. It stated, he emailed her everything. An hour later, he got a response. "You have a strong case. Let's talk." He barely remembered the drive into the city, just the way his hands shook slightly on the steering wheel. A cocktail of nerves, anger, and something else he hadn't felt in days. Hope. Monica's office was modest, clean, uncluttered. She greeted him with a firm handshake and sharp eyes that scanned him like a file. Not unkind, just focused. Like she was already pulling the threads together. "Mr. McDonald," she said, motioning him to sit. "I've reviewed your email. You're right. This isn't just trespassing. This is targeted property damage, likely harassment, and possibly fraud depending on what we find. And I want to help you hold them accountable." Carl let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He showed her everything again. The video, the documents, the screenshots from the HOA's own site. She nodded along, taking notes quickly and precisely. "They knew," she said. "They knew your home was outside their boundary, and they did it anyway." "But why?" Carl asked. "Why come after me?" Monica paused. Then she leaned forward. "Because HOAs like this, they get used to no one pushing back. They test people. They intimidate first, ask questions later. Your property is at the edge of their map. That makes you a target. And the worst part? You're not alone. I've handled 3 cases in the past year involving the same pattern. Quiet homeowners, minor infractions, sudden enforcement mistakes. Carl swallowed hard. So what now? We file a formal demand. We give them 10 business days to respond, compensate you for the damages, acknowledge wrongdoing, and apologize. If they don't, we sue. She tapped her pen once against her notebook. And I'll tell you something, Carl. If they think you're just another silent homeowner, they're about to find out how wrong they are. That night, Carl stood under the bare moonlight in his yard. The wind had picked up. It tugged at the edges of the tarp he'd laid across what remained of the flower beds. Somewhere, a dog barked. He crouched near the fence post they hadn't managed to completely remove and pressed his fingers into the dirt. You took this from me, he thought, but I'm taking something back. By morning, Monica had drafted the letter. Legal language, but clear enough that even someone like Radcliffe would feel the tremor in it. A breakdown of the damages, a demand for full reimbursement, evidence outlined and cataloged. The closing paragraph hit like a hammer. Failure to respond appropriately will result in legal action without further notice. Carl read it twice, then nodded. Send it. And so, the clock started ticking. 10 days. He filled the silence with work. Not his day job, but this. Rebuilding. Clearing the debris. Sweeping the broken slats of wood into piles. Pulling weeds that had sprung up overnight like opportunists. He couldn't afford to replace everything yet, but he could make this place feel a little less like a graveyard. Neighbors began to stop by. First, just Frank. The elderly man from 2 doors down who had once waved politely, but never talked much. They came after me, too, Frank said quietly. Fined me for having a garbage bin out past noon. Said I owed them $300. But, you're not in the HOA either, are you? Carl asked. Frank shook his head. Nope, but that didn't stop them. Others followed. A young couple, a single mom, a retired teacher who'd lived here since the 80s. Each one had a story. Each one had been pushed, silenced, or simply ignored, and each one stood in Carl's yard now with a different expression. Gratitude. They picked the wrong man this time, Frank muttered, looking over at the new pile of lumber Carl had delivered. You're the first one who stood your ground. When the 10 days passed, Monica called with a grim tone in her voice. They responded, she said, and they're doubling down. Denied all wrongdoing, claimed you were combative, claimed their actions were justified under emergency community standards. Carl's stomach turned. They're lying. I know. And now, we sue. The lawsuit was filed. The legal storm began. But something else happened, too. Something Radcliffe and his cronies never expected. The neighborhood started paying attention, not just to Carl's fight, but to their own silence. More affidavits came in. Photos, HOA newsletters that read like propaganda. Stories of overreach, patterns of abuse. And through it all, Carl stayed focused, until one morning, another envelope arrived in the mail. Not from the HOA, from a local reporter. Mr. McDonald, I'm writing a piece on HOA corruption in suburban neighborhoods. I heard about your case. I'd like to talk. Carl stared at the letter, heart racing. He hadn't wanted fame. He didn't want the attention, but maybe this was exactly what they were afraid of. Light truth. Someone finally saying, enough. The courthouse smelled like old wood, paper, and quiet judgment. Carl sat in the hallway, eyes fixed on the polished floor beneath his boots. His heart was steady, not calm, but focused. That kind of stillness that only comes after a storm. When you're standing in the wreckage and you've decided you're not going to run anymore. Beside him, Monica was reviewing papers, flipping through them like a surgeon inspecting her tools. Calm, sharp, dangerous in all the right ways. They'll try to intimidate you on the stand, she said without looking up. Radcliffe's legal team is experienced, polished. But we have something they don't. Carl looked up. What's that? She finally met his gaze. The truth. The lawsuit had lit a fire under the neighborhood. Carl's case wasn't just a personal matter anymore. It was a symbol, a line in the sand. People started talking. Really talking. Sharing stories that had been buried under years of apathy and fear. Letters from the HOA that didn't make sense. Fines for rules that didn't exist. Sudden threats. From uniformed enforcers that nobody had questioned until now. Carl's front yard had become a meeting place. Frank came by almost daily. He brought others. A young woman named Renee, who'd been fined $600 for a wind chime violation. An elderly couple who were told their mailbox design was non-conforming, despite having had it for 12 years. Every story echoed the same. Pattern, silence, fear, powerlessness. But now that silence was breaking. Monica compiled everything. Not just Carl's evidence, but testimonies from residents across the community. Photos, letters, emails, even HOA newsletters that contradicted their own rules. It wasn't just a case anymore. It was a pattern, a blueprint of abuse, outlined, in black and white, and Radcliffe? He wasn't backing down. Instead, he'd done what men like him always do, double down and deflect. Weeks before the trial, the HOA sent out a glossy, full-color newsletter to every mailbox in the neighborhood. The cover headline read, "Protecting Our Standards, the Truth About the McDonald Incident." Inside, Carl's name was smeared with vague accusations, that he was uncooperative, that he had aggressively resisted routine compliance checks, that he was undermining the values of the neighborhood. It was laughable, but it was also dangerous. "I want to respond," Carl said to Monica after reading it. "Set the record straight." Monica shook her head. "Not yet. Let them dig their own grave." And dig they did, because what Radcliffe hadn't anticipated was the subpoena. Monica filed it quietly, but it hit hard. Internal HOA communications, board meeting minutes, enforcement protocols. She wanted everything. At first, they stalled. Then they delayed. Then they tried to fight it. But the judge sided with her. And that's when the real story started to unravel. Emails from Radcliffe to board members discussing strategic pressure points. Notes describing Carl's property as a soft target. A message from a board member stating outright, "He's not technically under us, but if he doesn't push back, it sets a precedent." Carl read that line over and over. Not technically under us, but they came anyway, because they thought he'd stay quiet. Now the court date was here. Carl adjusted his tie in the reflection of the hallway window. His palms were damp, but his spine was straight. Monica stood and nodded toward the courtroom door. "Let's show them what fighting back looks like." Inside, the atmosphere was tense. A few journalists in the back. HOA board members clustered, like shadows in one row. Radcliffe sat front and center, his expression unreadable, flanked by a clean-cut legal team in tailored suits. Carl took the stand. He started with the basics, his background, the purchase of the home, the joy he felt in moving there, then the incident, the knock at the door, the trespassers, the destruction. When he described how the flower beds were pulled up, his voice wavered. It wasn't about the flowers. It was about how safe that space made me feel. It was the first thing I'd built after moving in. It felt like mine. Monica guided him gently. What did you do after they left? I gathered everything, Carl said. Proof, evidence. But mostly, I sat in silence, because I didn't know if anyone would believe me. She paused. And now? Carl looked directly at Radcliffe. Now I know the only thing scarier than standing up is staying silent. Monica introduced the video footage, the photos, the boundary map, the deed. Then she walked the jury through the internal HOA emails. When the line appeared, "He's not technically under us," there was a collective murmur. Monica let the silence hang before turning back to Carl. Did anyone from the HOA apologize? No. Did they offer to replace what they destroyed? Not once. Then it was Radcliffe's turn. He took the stand with confidence, all smooth diction and rehearsed calm. Our intention, he said, was to protect neighborhood standards. We believed, in good faith, that Mr. McDonald's property fell within our scope. If there was an error, it was procedural, not malicious. Monica rose slowly. Mr. Radcliffe, are you familiar with your own HOA's jurisdiction map? Yes. She displayed it on the courtroom screen. Does this show Mr. McDonald's home within your boundaries? No. And yet you authorized an enforcement team to enter and dismantle parts of his property? Our enforcement team acted based on recommendations. Based on recommendations from you, correct? She interrupted. Radcliffe shifted. I approve the operation, yes. She stepped closer. And when you saw the map? When you saw that Carl McDonald was not under your authority, what did you do? He hesitated. I believed we were acting in the best interest of the community. Monica walked slowly back to the jury box. Is it in the best interest of a community to target homeowners they know they have no authority over? To lie about violations? To destroy property? To call peaceful resistance aggressive? She let each question sink in. Then quietly she added, or was this just about seeing how much you could get away with? The courtroom was silent. When closing statements came, Monica didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. This case is about power, not legal power, not moral power, just assumed power. A man was targeted because he was quiet, because he lived alone, because they thought he wouldn't fight back. But he did, and in doing so, he stood up for every homeowner who's ever been bullied by an HOA that forgot it answers to its residents, not the other way around. Carl sat frozen as the jury left to deliberate. It felt like hours. In reality, it was just over one. When the foreman returned, Carl didn't breathe until he heard the words. We find in favor of the plaintiff, HOA, guilty of trespassing, guilty of property damage, guilty of harassment, ordered to pay full compensation, and then some punitive damages, enough to sting. Carl barely heard the final number. All he could do was sit, stunned, as a quiet weight lifted off his chest. Radcliffe didn't look at him, couldn't, and Carl didn't need him to, because the victory wasn't about a dollar amount. It wasn't about revenge. It was about something deeper, proving they were wrong to believe he'd stay silent. The verdict didn't feel real at first. Carl walked out of the courthouse like a man who'd survived a shipwreck, clothes dry, voice silent, but something inside still thrashing against the waves. He heard the voices around him, Monica's. Calm assurance, the hum of reporters, the quiet applause from a few neighbors seated in the back. But it all passed by like wind. He had won, legally, officially, undeniably. He had won. The HOA had been found guilty. Trespassing, harassment, property destruction. The damages awarded weren't just symbolic, they were significant. Enough to repair what had been lost, and then some. But the truth? The money wasn't what mattered most. It was standing there, in front of a jury, in front of Radcliffe, and knowing they saw him. Heard him, believed him. That was the real victory. Monica handed him a check a few days later, along with a congratulatory smile and a firm handshake. "You just set a precedent," she said. "Other HOAs are watching this case, and they're nervous." Carl tried to smile, but it came out tight. "Good. Let them be." She nodded. "If they want to govern, they need to do it with integrity, not fear." Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. First it was whispers at mailboxes, then long conversations at porches, then full-on gatherings in Carl's yard, where once there had only been debris and silence. He rebuilt it slowly, not just with money, but with care. He hired local contractors to reconstruct the fence and rebuild the shed. But the flowers? He replanted those himself, this time with tougher roots, hardier blooms. Neighbors came by to help. Some brought shovels, others brought iced tea, a few brought nothing but company. And that was enough. Frank showed up first, as always, leaned on his cane and stared at the new posts going up. "They're scared now," he said with a grin. "The ones that used to bark every time my garbage bins were out 15 minutes late haven't said a word since the verdict." Carl laughed. It was the first real laugh in weeks. Another neighbor, Denise, brought over a tray of homemade brownies and an old newspaper clipping. "You inspired us," she said, pressing the article into Carl's hands. It was a profile piece about a neighborhood in another city that had fought back against an oppressive HOA. The headline read, "One man can change everything." Carl stared at it. He wasn't sure he deserved the credit, but he was starting to understand something. It wasn't just about his backyard anymore. The smear campaign Radcliffe had launched before the trial had backfired spectacularly. The HOA's newsletter, once used to boast about upholding neighborhood standards, had become a joke, its glossy pages discredited by the very jury Radcliffe had hoped to impress. But what Carl didn't expect was what came next. He received a letter, hand-delivered, no return address. Just a plain white envelope slid under his front door. Inside was a folded piece of paper with 10 signatures at the bottom. Each one belonged to a current HOA board member. Each one was a resignation. Radcliffe's name was at the top, his swirling, arrogant signature looking suddenly small. They didn't apologize. They didn't explain. They just vanished. Carl read the note 3 times before setting it aside. Then he picked it back up, folded it carefully, and placed it in the drawer with the court documents. Not out of spite, not for the record, but as a reminder of what pressure could do when applied by someone who refused to back down. With the board dissolved, the HOA was forced to organize a special election. Carl received an official letter in the mail inviting him to run for a seat on the new board. He read it in silence. That night, Frank stopped by and saw the letter on the table. "You gonna run?" he asked. Carl shook his head slowly. "No, I think I've had enough HOA politics for a lifetime." Frank chuckled. "Probably wise, but if you ever change your mind, you've got a neighborhood behind you now." Instead of running, Carl did something else. He started a community forum. Nothing flashy, just a simple online space where residents could share concerns, ask questions, and hold the HOA accountable in the most transparent way possible. No anonymous threats, no bogus fines, just neighbors talking to neighbors. He also launched a neighborhood watch group, not to patrol like enforcers, but to protect, to help, to make sure no one else woke up to strangers in their backyard, dismantling their peace piece by piece. Monica, who had remained in touch since the trial, helped him draft a guide for homeowners in the area, a small but powerful PDF, outlining their rights, explaining how to check for HOA boundaries, and warning signs of abuse. It circulated faster than expected. Even residents in other neighborhoods began requesting copies. Carl didn't do interviews. He didn't go on television. He wasn't interested in becoming a symbol, but that didn't stop the story from spreading. One morning, while Carl was watering his newly planted flowers, a car pulled up. A young man stepped out, maybe in his early 30s, holding a small notebook. "Are you Carl McDonald?" he asked. Carl wiped his hands on a towel. "Depends on who's asking," the man smiled. "Name's Josh. My parents live 2 neighborhoods over. They've had a lot of problems with their HOA, too. I just wanted to say, thanks. You gave people like them a reason to push back." Carl nodded slowly. "Tell them, don't wait until it's too late. Speak up. Document everything, and never think they're too small to fight." Josh left with a smile and a handshake, and Carl stood there, feeling something he hadn't in a long time. Peace. Not the fragile kind, the real kind, the kind that comes after battle. But even then, even in that hard-earned peace, one final shadow loomed. The HOA had filed an appeal. Carl found out through Monica, who called one afternoon while he was building shelves for the new shed. "They're trying to reduce the punitive damages," she said. "Nothing new, just a delay tactic. They're hoping to wear you down." Carl set the hammer down gently. "Then they haven't learned a thing." "You still want to fight it?" Monica asked. "Absolutely." They prepared for a second, legal battle. It didn't last long. The judge dismissed the appeal within weeks. The original verdict stood. The HOA was forced to pay every single cent, and their reputation ruined. As the dust settled, Carl decided to throw a barbecue. It wasn't a celebration. Not really. More like a thank you. A gathering for the people who had stood by him, spoken up, or simply shown up when it mattered most. Neighbors filled his yard with laughter and music. The fence stood tall and strong. The flowers had bloomed again, brighter, more resilient than before. Carl walked among the crowd with a quiet smile, offering plates, telling stories, and occasionally stepping aside to watch. He didn't want a spotlight. He just wanted to see what unity looked like, and it was beautiful. For weeks after the barbecue, Carl would find himself standing quietly on his back porch, just watching the fence he rebuilt, watching the new flowers swaying in the breeze, watching the shadows in the yard and realizing, for the first time in a long time, they didn't feel like they were closing in. The scars were still there, of course. He saw them in the patches of soil that hadn't yet grown over, in the corners of the shed where certain tools had been replaced with cheaper versions. But more than that, the scars lived in how he looked over his shoulder when he heard a knock, how he still expected someone to walk into his space uninvited. Peace, it turned out, wasn't the same thing as forgetting, and maybe it wasn't supposed to be. He received another envelope in the mail, but this one didn't come from a court, or a lawyer, or the HOA. It was from a woman named Emily Torrance, a homeowner from a different state. Her handwriting was neat and small. The letter was short, but every word landed with weight. I saw your story online. Our HOA has been bullying us for years. When I watched what you did, I cried. Not because you won, but because it made me believe we still can. Carl read it 3 times, then again before bed. The next morning, he woke up to 3 more emails, then 6, then a dozen. Homeowners from across the country. Some had seen clips from local news segments. Others had read the article a freelance journalist had written online, but every message echoed the same thing. You gave us courage. Carl wasn't sure what to do with that. He hadn't set out to be a symbol. He still didn't want to be. But he also knew what it felt like to have nowhere to turn. And he couldn't ignore the pull in his gut, the one that told him maybe there was something more to do now. The online forum he started began to grow. At first, it had only served his neighborhood, a digital bulletin board to swap tips, raise concerns, or schedule meetings. But now, members from neighboring communities joined in, then neighboring counties, then another state. Carl expanded it, added more categories, clearer resources, downloadable guides. Monica helped, even offered pro bono guidance on legal, templates, and cease and desist letters. They called it Homeowners Rising. Simple, no branding, no flashy design, but it was real, and it was theirs. Frank dropped by one afternoon, wearing sunglasses and a crooked grin. Look at you, he said, sipping from his lemonade, all community hero and digital vigilante. Carl laughed. I'm not trying to lead a revolution. Doesn't matter, Frank said. You already lit the match. Carl paused, then nodded. The following week, a woman named Sharon messaged through the forum. She lived just 2 streets away in a smaller cul-de-sac that had always kept to itself. She was polite, apologetic even, but her message shook something loose in Carl's chest. I've been afraid to say anything for years. The HOA president threatened my husband with legal action when he questioned a late fee. We ended up paying, even though we knew it was wrong. But after seeing what you did, I think I'm ready to talk. Carl invited her for coffee. She came, alone, nervous, twisting her ring with trembling fingers. But when she spoke, she didn't hold back. They had files, letters, screenshots, audio recordings. The HOA had harassed not just Sharon's family, but 3 other homes on her block, and no one had said anything. Until now. Carl didn't hesitate. He connected her with Monica, helped her upload her documents, walked her through every step, and then he watched something beautiful happen. Sharon stood up. She spoke at a community meeting, not angry, not emotional, just steady, calm, honest. I stayed quiet, she said, because I thought we had no power, because I thought no one would stand with us, but Carl did, and if he can, maybe I can too. The room went silent. Then someone stood, then another. By the end of the night, the cul-de-sac had become a movement. The HOA couldn't smear Sharon the way they had Carl, not now, not when the community was watching, not when everything was documented and shared. Carl saw the shift happening in real time. For years, the HOA had ruled by isolation, picking people off one by one. Private letters, veiled threats, empty fines no one questioned. But now, the silence had broken. They couldn't hide behind fear anymore. They were outnumbered. A month later, Carl was invited to speak on a local radio show. He almost declined. But then he thought of Sharon, of Frank, of the dozen homeowners he'd helped since. He accepted. The interview was quiet, thoughtful. The host asked simple questions. Carl gave honest answers. He didn't rant. He didn't accuse. He just spoke like a man who had been through fire and come out with clarity. "When you're standing alone," he said near the end, "it's easy to believe your voice doesn't matter. That what's happening to you isn't enough to fight over. But it is. Because abuse, even small, leaves scars. And no one has the right to tell you how loudly you're allowed to defend your home." The clip went viral. The forum doubled in size in less than a week. Monica called and laughed over the phone. "Well, Carl," she said, "you may not want to be a leader, but you've officially become one." He rubbed his eyes. "I just want people to feel safe in their own homes." "Exactly," she said. "That's what makes you the right person." But even now, even as things shifted, Carl stayed grounded. He still watered his flowers every morning, still fixed his own fences when they cracked, still walked the neighborhood at night, picking up trash along the sidewalks because it made the place feel lived in. He didn't forget where he started, or how small that first morning made him feel, standing in his backyard, watching strangers destroy everything he had quietly built. That image never left him, and maybe it wasn't supposed to. One evening, while Carl was sitting under the patio, lights with a soft jazz record playing in the background, he heard a knock on the door. It was Frank again, but this time he held something behind his back. "What now?" Carl asked, half laughing. "Another letter from a secret fan club?" Frank smirked. "Not quite." He handed Carl a photo frame. Inside was a blown-up image of Carl's backyard. Before the raid, flowers in full bloom, fence freshly stained, tools hung neatly on the shed, a quiet kind of beauty. Below it was a handwritten note. "You didn't just rebuild your yard, you rebuilt our courage." Carl didn't speak, just stared, then nodded once, quietly, because sometimes the strongest things we build can't be seen from the street. Power rarely vanishes. It simply changes shape. Carl learned that the hard way. It didn't come in the form of boots marching through his backyard this time. There was no fence torn down, no flower beds trampled, no uniforms. This time, it came in suits. It came with smiles that didn't touch the eyes and compliments that felt like warnings dressed in sugar. At first, it was subtle, a call from a county official, polite, professional, congratulating Carl on his community engagement, then gently suggesting he consider pulling back from the HOA reform conversation to allow the new board time to adjust. Carl listened. He nodded. Then he ignored it. He had no interest in disrupting the new board. In fact, most of the members were decent people who had been blindsided by the culture Radcliffe left behind. But the idea of stepping back, just when others were finally stepping forward, that felt wrong. So he didn't. Instead, he started organizing monthly meetups, open forums held at the local community center. No titles, no leaders, just homeowners, talking openly, sharing what was working, what wasn't, what they feared. People showed up, dozens at first. Then more. Some came from other towns. Some drove hours just to say, "This happened to me, too." Carl didn't speak much at the meetings. He didn't need to. His presence alone, the man who fought and won, was enough. But when he did speak, he kept it simple. You don't need permission to ask questions, and you don't need credentials to stand your ground. Not everyone liked that. The pushback came next, not from the broken HOA board, but from those who had quietly benefited from the chaos it left behind. Developers, property managers, real estate consultants who didn't want headlines about rogue HOAs scaring away investors. Carl got a letter in the mail. It looked official, stamped, sealed, professional tone, but buried in the legalese was the message: cease statements that portray the HOA or affiliated entities in a defamatory light. Carl read it twice, then handed it to Monica. She scanned it once, then smiled faintly. "They're nervous," she said. "This is a bluff. They're trying to scare me again. They're trying to silence the conversation before it reaches someone with even more influence than you." That night, Carl sat outside on the porch, listening to the distant chirp of crickets, wondering what kind of world punished people more for speaking out than for doing harm. He wasn't angry. Not exactly, just tired. He didn't want to be famous. Didn't want to be a movement. He wanted a backyard with blooming flowers, a working shed, and peace. But peace, he realized, wasn't the same as comfort. Peace required effort, and sometimes sacrifice. He responded publicly, not with outrage, but clarity. He posted the letter, redacted names, and added one sentence: "I fought to be heard, I won't be quiet now." The post was shared hundreds of times, and for the first time, a journalist from a major paper called Carl almost didn't answer. But he did. The reporter was calm, respectful. He wasn't chasing drama, he was chasing patterns. And what he'd found was disturbing. Over 60 cases in the past 2 years where HOAs had unlawfully enforced rules beyond their jurisdiction. Dozens of those homeowners had caved under pressure. Some sold their homes. A few even faced bogus liens. "What makes your story different," the reporter said, "is that you pushed back, and it worked." Carl didn't offer a quote, just a sentence: "I was lucky. Others shouldn't have to be." The article was published the following week. It went viral, and suddenly Carl's name was everywhere again. His inbox overflowed. Requests for interviews, public speaking events, podcast appearances, advocacy groups offering partnerships. Carl sat at his desk, staring at the flood. He didn't feel proud. He felt the pressure. Because every voice that reached out wasn't just inspired. They were asking for help. He called Monica. "Tell me the truth," he said. "Am I in over my head?" She didn't sugarcoat it. "Yes, but so were they when they came after you. You didn't ask to be a leader, Carl, but now you are one. And that means you get to decide what to do with that power." He exhaled slowly and made a decision. He created a nonprofit, Safe House. A simple name, a simple mission: to educate, protect, and empower homeowners facing HOA abuse. Not with lawyers, though they had a few volunteers. Not with protests, though they weren't afraid to speak up, but with information. With visibility, with unity. Safe House offered free resources, legal referrals, a hotline for anonymous reports, and slowly, it began to matter. Carl's days blurred into weeks. organizing, updating, attending town halls, helping people write their first formal letters of protest. But the thing that haunted him most? A letter from a woman in Florida. Single mother. Her HOA had charged her thousands in compliance penalties over the course of a year. She couldn't afford a lawyer. She couldn't afford to leave. She didn't want to fight anymore. Her final line in the letter read, "They broke me before anyone could help." Carl didn't sleep that night. He sat in the shed, staring at the quiet space he'd rebuilt, and realized winning his case wasn't enough. It was just the beginning. So, he pressed harder, pushed for legislation in his state to limit HOA authority, partnered with 2 local representatives, testified at a city council meeting about what happened to him and what was still happening to others. It was grueling, vulnerable, frustrating, but it worked. The council passed a resolution requiring HOAs to publicly publish their jurisdiction maps and inform homeowners annually of their rights to opt out, when applicable by state law. It wasn't a revolution, but it was a start. One afternoon, Carl got another knock on the door. This time, it was a boy, maybe 12, holding a potted plant. "My dad says you're the reason we didn't have to move." Carl smiled gently. "What's this?" "Drought-tolerant hibiscus," the boy said proudly. "We planted them after we got that fake vine removed. Thought you might want one." Carl knelt down and took the pot carefully. "Thanks," he said. "I'll make sure it has a good home." That night he planted it near the edge of the yard, right along the line where the old fence had been ripped out, where it all began. The petals were bright, the soil was soft, and when the wind came, it didn't carry fear anymore. It carried something else, something stronger. Hope. Carl didn't notice how tired he had become. Not at first. When the calls started coming in past midnight, desperate homeowners from different time zones, afraid, crying, asking for help, he always answered. When local reporters asked him to comment on new HOA abuse stories, he gave them his time. When someone needed help writing a cease and desist letter, he wrote it with them, line by line. And when Safe House's inbox hit 200 unread messages in a single week, he stayed, up sorting them all because Carl McDonald didn't know how to stop helping. But the truth, he was running on fumes. He started forgetting small things, appointments, meals, sometimes whole days blurred together. He'd stare at his laptop screen and see nothing but static behind his eyes. There were nights he fell asleep in the shed, only waking when the early light broke through the window and landed across his chest like a weight. Frank noticed first. "You look pale," he said one morning. Not just tired, hollow. Carl tried to smile. "I'm okay." "No, you're not," Frank said. "You're burning both ends of the candle, son. You can't carry everyone." Carl sat on the porch steps and rubbed the back of his neck. "But who else will?" Frank sat beside him, the old wood creaking beneath their weight. "Listen, you started this thing, and God bless you for it. But movements don't stay on one man's shoulders forever. If they do, the man breaks." Carl didn't answer, because deep down he felt it too, the cracks forming. But just when he considered pulling back, just when he started dreaming about planting more flowers and reclaiming his mornings, it happened. The final strike. It came on a Thursday. Carl opened his mailbox and found a certified letter from a legal firm he didn't recognize. The envelope was thick, too thick. Inside were over a dozen pages, formal, dense, intimidating. A lawsuit, filed against Carl McDonald, personally. Not by an HOA, but by a corporate real estate development group with major investments in managed communities. The claim? Defamation, tortious interference, and the deliberate spread of false information that caused financial harm. Carl stared at the words, hands cold. They were accusing him of inciting fear, damaging the image of homeowner, associations, and, most galling of all, interfering with private governance frameworks essential to suburban order. The document demanded over $500,000 in damages. Carl sat in silence for nearly half an hour. He didn't cry, he didn't panic, he just sat, because he knew. This wasn't about winning a case, it was about wearing him down, and it was working. He called Monica. She picked up on the first ring. "I got hit," he said quietly. There was a long pause. Then, "Come to my office. Now." When Carl arrived, Monica was already moving like a storm. She had her reading glasses perched low and a fire in her eyes. "I've dealt with these guys before," she said. "This is a strategic lawsuit, a slap suit. They're not trying to win, they're trying to drain you." "Can they?" "Not if we fight back." Carl sank into the chair across from her. "I don't know if I can keep going," he admitted. "Every time I help someone, it feels like another target paints itself on my back." Monica softened. She sat down too, this time across from him, not as a lawyer, but as a friend. "Carl, look at what you've built. People are standing up. HOAs are being investigated. There's real policy change happening. You did that. But no one expects you to bleed for this forever. You've earned the right to rest. Let me carry this now." He didn't argue, because for once, he wanted someone else to. Monica filed a response the next day. She held a press conference that week, a small one, local reporters, nothing flashy. She made the point clear. This is an attack not just on Essed Carl McDonald, but on the right of any citizen to speak the truth. This is what power does when it's afraid. Public opinion swung hard. The same journalist who had written the viral article months ago picked up the story again. Other lawyers came forward offering help. Advocacy groups issued statements in support of Carl. Even state representatives began to weigh in. And behind all of that, the people, thousands of them, flooding Safe House with letters, donations, support. One woman wrote, "They can sue you, but they can't silence what you've already given us. The knowledge that we're not alone." Carl stepped back, not out, but back. He let Monica lead. He passed the reins of Safe House's daily operations to a small team of volunteers, people he trusted, people who cared, and slowly he began healing. He woke up one morning and didn't check his phone first. He brewed his coffee and drank it sitting down. He spent an entire day planting, not to prove a point, not to reclaim space, but because he wanted to see something grow again. The lawsuit? Dismissed within 3 months. The court called it what it was, baseless intimidation, and in the ruling, the judge included one simple line: "The right to challenge abuse of power is fundamental." Carl read it slowly, and then he cried, not from fear, from relief, from release, from knowing that maybe finally he could stop bracing for the next hit. That night, as the sun set behind his shed and the yard filled with shadows that no longer felt like threats, Carl stood barefoot in the grass. He looked around, not at the flowers or the fence, but at what couldn't be seen, the people, the movement, the strength that had multiplied when he thought he had nothing left to give. And in that quiet moment, he finally allowed himself to believe he had done enough. He didn't need to carry it all anymore. He just had to keep standing and let others rise beside him. It started with a knock, and it ended with one too. But this one was different. No uniform, no clipboard, no badge, just a soft rhythm, 3 taps, and a familiar voice on the other side. "Carl, you home?" He opened the door to find Frank standing there, holding an envelope and wearing a grin that looked like it had waited months to stretch across his face. "You got a minute?" Carl stepped aside. Always. Frank handed him the envelope and walked past him onto the porch, settling into his favorite old chair like it belonged to him. And maybe in a way it did. After all, Frank had been there before the first fence post was torn out, before the lawsuit, before Safe House. He had seen the war, and survived it too. Carl opened the envelope and pulled out a handwritten note. It wasn't from Frank. It was from the neighborhood, not a petition, not a formal request, just a letter, signed by dozens of names. The message was short, clear, and deeply human. "Thank you. You gave us back our voice." Carl read it in silence. The wind blew gently through the trees, rustling the leaves like applause. Frank reached into his jacket and pulled out something else, a small, rough-edged stone with black paint across the top. "What's that?" Carl asked. Frank shrugged. "Found it on your sidewalk. One of the neighbor kids painted it. Says, 'Hope lives here. Thought you ought to keep it.'" Carl turned the stone over in his hand. The paint was already starting to chip. But the message was still clear. "Hope lives here." He smiled and set it on the patio table beside him. A quiet monument. It had been nearly a year since the raid. Nearly a year since he'd watched strangers dismantle his peace with measured cruelty and fake authority. Since he'd called the police and been told it was a civil matter. Since he'd felt like just another name on a list of people who'd be too tired to fight back. But the world had changed since then. He had changed. The shed had been rebuilt twice now. Once after the raid, and again after he decided it needed more space. He called it a peace project, even though no one really asked. The new fence was stronger, stained a deeper color and carved with initials, not his, but from neighbors who had helped him dig and hammer in the posts. They'd come over one afternoon with sandwiches, tools, and stories. No one asked for thanks. That was the thing about healing. It rarely made noise, but it showed up, in flower beds that bloomed again, in mailboxes free of threats, in community meetings filled with conversation instead of fear. The HOA still existed, but it looked different now, transparent, accountable, human. Carl didn't attend the meetings anymore. Didn't need to. Other voices filled the space. Strong ones, informed ones. He had helped build the foundation, but it was never meant to be his alone. Safe House continued growing, now run by a volunteer board across 3 states. Carl still advised when needed, but he'd stepped back, not out of exhaustion this time, but out of trust. The thing had taken root. It no longer needed him in the center. He remembered something Monica said once, back when the pressure campaign tried to break him. "You were the fuse, but not the fire." She was right. He'd simply lit the match. The wind had carried it farther than he ever imagined. Now when people passed by Carl's home, they didn't see a battleground. They saw flowers, a yard well kept, a front porch with worn chairs and lantern lights. A place that felt still, but not forgotten. One evening, a young man named Jason knocked on his door. He looked nervous, early 20s, arms crossed like he was holding something inside. Carl opened the door. "Can I help you?" Jason nodded. I live down on Crescent. You probably don't know me, but I just bought my first home. And last week I got my first warning notice from the HOA. It didn't make sense. They said my garden wasn't up to code. I checked the bylaws. There's no mention of gardens. Carl raised an eyebrow. You think it's intimidation? Jason hesitated. I don't know, but I wanted to ask, how did you start fighting back? Carl stepped outside and motioned to the bench near his flower beds. Come sit, he said. It starts with knowing they count on you staying quiet. And for the next hour, he shared his story. Not the dramatic parts, not the courtrooms or the camera flashes, just the feeling, the helplessness. The moment he realized no one was coming to save him. And then, the moment he realized maybe he didn't need saving. When Jason left, he thanked Carl quietly, like someone who had been carrying something too heavy for too long and finally found a place to set it down. Carl watched him disappear down the street, then turned back toward his porch. That night, the neighborhood was quiet. No sirens, no arguments, no dread in the air. Just the sound of the wind brushing gently through the trees and the warm glow of porch lights flickering on, one by one. Carl sat alone with a notebook in his lap. He wrote slowly. Not a speech, not a blog, not even a journal entry. Just a sentence. I no longer feel like I'm waiting for the worst. He closed the notebook and leaned back. And as he looked across his backyard, the one they once tried to take, he realized something deeper than victory. It was never about fighting the HOA. It was about fighting the feeling that you don't matter, that you can't stop what's coming, that your voice, your life, is small enough to be erased with a clipboard and a badge no one earned. And yet, here he was, still standing, still rooted, like the flowers blooming beside him, tougher than they looked. As the stars came out and the night wrapped its arms around the neighborhood, Carl picked up the painted stone from the table and held it, close. Hope lives here. Not in the house, not in the garden, but in the man who refused to disappear, and in the hundreds of others who rose because he did.